Hi, I'm Jill Barshay at the Hechinger Report. Thank you all for your patience. Let's jump right in talking about the NAEP test results that are coming out next Monday. I'd like to start with Grady Wilburn, who is a statistician extraordinaire with the Assessment Division at the National Center for Education Statistics, which is the statistical unit within the Department of Education. Grady, please teach us what we're about to get next Monday.
I'm happy to. It's saying I can't share my screen while the other participant is sharing. So as soon as the other participant stops sharing, there we go. All right. And okay, I'm hoping you all can see my slides here. So can you see my full screen slides?
Yes.
No,
Great.
no, you should switch over to the other view.
Gotcha. Okay. How's that?
Much better.
All right, great. Okay. So thank you for the introduction. My name is Grady Wilburn, and I am not only a statistician at the department, but I am also help coordinate all the NAEP releases. And so I'm really excited to be here, not only to talk to you all about NAEP data, but honestly to hear the questions you all have, because you all ask such great questions and you all are such an important stakeholder group because you share NAEP findings with all your listeners and readers. And so I'm really happy to be here, hear the difficult questions, and the ones that I can't answer, I'll get answers to, so the next time you ask them, I'll be able to answer them. So I work for the National Center for Education Statistics, and we collect the data, we analyze the data, and we report the data, all under the guise of our commissioner, Dr. Peggy Carr, who you're seeing here on the slide. Peggy has been over the NAEP program for decades. She was recently presidentially appointed last year by President Biden to lead the National Center for Education Statistics, and so she has been doing that for about the last year and a half or so. So NAEP, or the National Assessment of Education of Progress, or the nation's report card, is a congressionally mandated assessment that's administered by NCS. It's a common measure of student achievement across the several different subjects. You see some of those logos off to the side. Math and reading, we have national level, we have state level, and we have district level. For all other subjects, we pretty much keep it at the national level. These data are important, particularly data that we're releasing next week, is because it's going to give us a measure of how student achievement looked pre-national school closures, pre-pandemic to current 2022. So we collected the data that we're going to share with you all next week, January through March of this year. And you see all the different student groups that we break our data down by, national, race, ethnicity. But we also have a nice set of survey questions that we ask students, teachers, and schools. And so they ask about the educational environment, and it's a really great way of contextualizing the findings you'll see now. But I also add, it's also a great resource when you're writing other stories about students or teachers or schools, and you want some data about them to contextualize or to help enhance your story. It's just a wealth of information that I'm really excited about sharing with you all. So like I mentioned, on October 24th, we will release 2022 data, which we'll be able to compare to not only 2019, but several years between 2019 all the way back to the early 2000s. Most states participated probably starting in the late 90s, but starting in 2003, we have participation for all states. I'll add that we also have participation for Puerto Rico in mathematics, District of Columbia, as well as Department of Defense schools. I talked about the student demographics already that we have. We also have data by school location, city, suburb, town, and rural. And we have public school. We have private school. We often cannot report private school by itself because of the response rate being so low, but we can report Catholic school response rates because they are the largest subsidiary, if you will, of private school. And their response rate is usually at a level where we can reliably report that estimate for private school students, or I'm sorry, for Catholic school students. So I know you all are like, you just released data not too long ago. So what's this new data set? How is it different? So the data we released on September 1st was our long-term trend assessment. And so if you think of NAEP, we have kind of two families of assessments. Long-term trend, which is age-based, it's a little more simple compared to main NAEP. It goes all the way back to the early 1970s, 9, 13, and 17-year-olds. It's only national level, and it's only in math and reading. And while we do have a student questionnaire, and for the first time, a school questionnaire, we do not have a teacher questionnaire for long-term trend like we do from the main NAEP assessment. So now I'm going to just talk to you about how we present the results, just as kind of a refresher for most of you all and an introduction to the rest of you all, hopefully to inform some questions as we go into the Q&A here. So the first thing is NAEP is given to a sample of schools and students. So we don't test every single school or every single student in the state or a district. We get a sample of students that represent the population of that district or of that state. And because of that, we have estimates for those jurisdictions, that district or that state. And therefore, there's a little bit, I like to call it wiggle room around that number, that margin of error around that number, given that we didn't test every single student or every single school. Therefore, when we talk about differences, we're talking about a difference that is statistically significant. And so you may see two numbers that aren't numerically the same, but again, given that wiggle room around those two numbers, we do a statistical analysis to see if we could say that those differences are actually different. So if we talk about two numbers and they numerically look different, but we say they're the same, that's because we have to consider these things called margin of error and things whether those numbers are statistically significantly different from each other. All right, long-term trend, we had about 10,000 9-year-olds. For main NAEP, we have a much larger sample, almost 500,000 students from about 10,000 schools when you can look at 4th and 8th grade combined. We have scale scores, and these scale scores go to 0 to 500 for both math and reading, and they reflect what students know and can do. It allows us to compare one state score in math to another state score in math, and it can be used to compare the student groups that we just talked about to each other. And so that's one of the advantages of the scale scores. I know there is some confusion around scale scores, like what does a 3-point change mean? I hope to get into that a little bit and giving you some tools, I'll say, to help your audience understand what exactly those things mean. And this is an example of how we report those scale scores. The asterisk I just talked about, that means whether or not that number is statistically different from the most recent number. And then you see our trend line. This is for 8th grade reading with the 2019 number. So that's how we report significance with our scale scores and looking at our trend. We also have achievement levels. I'm not going to say too much here because I know Marty is going to go into these in detail, but this is another way in where we talk about findings with the achievement levels that the National Assessment Governing Board produces and creates. And we have 3 of them: NAEP Advanced, Proficient, and NAEP Basic. And I'm not going to say too much here, again, given my time. Also, I know Marty's going to go into a little more detail on the achievement levels. But then this is how we report them. Usually in terms of the percent at or above NAEP Proficient. And when we do that, we're adding the at Proficient plus the at Advanced. And that's how we get that 41% at or above NAEP Proficient, not to be confused with state proficient. We also look at achievement by percentiles. If you've been paying attention to the stories coming out of NAEP, we've been talking about this divergence where you're seeing the lower performers, which we define as those at the 10th and the 25th percentile, versus higher performers, where we define those at the 75th and the 90th percentile, with the middle being those at the 50th percentile. And that's how we use, you have that average score, but it's really helpful sometimes to kind of look behind that average score and see what goes into it. Obviously, there's going to be, with any average, those students above it and those students below it. And it's good to see how the patterns may be the same or may be different by those performance levels. And this is one way in which we display that, with those trend lines at the top representing those higher performing students. And you see kind of how those coalesce with the achievement levels, and then those at the bottom with the 10th and the 25th representing those lower performing students. Like I mentioned, we have, as part of our report card that NCS produces, a survey questionnaire in which we'll highlight some of the school, teacher, and student questions that we found interesting, but it's kind of just to whet your appetite and getting your hands dirty and finding some other contextual variables that you all may find interesting, given the audience that you're writing for, given the subject matter that you choose to cover. And again, we have this for all of our main NAEP assessment, student, teachers, and schools, and you can mine those using the NAEP Data Explorer. So finally, I'm just going to end with some guidance for interpreting the results. I know Marty's going to talk about this as well, so I'm not going to go into it too much, but I do want to reiterate the correlation is not causation. The way we collect our data, we can't say that this caused that. We can say that these things are related. But again, I'm going to, given my time and given Marty's content, I'm going to just kind of breeze through this a little bit. And one of those questions that I get a lot of media is, so, things change by 3 points. Like, what does that mean? One way to look at that is to look at questions, right? And so we heard those questions. Part of the 2022 NAEP report card will look at items that were asked in both 2022 and 2019 and say, okay, in 2019, this percent of students got this item right. And this is what this item covers. This is where this item maps to as far as our, our subscales and the framework. In 2022, this percent got it right. And so it's better than using a percentage, the raw score percentage, which I think is more digestible to readers than our scale scores often can be. So between that and the item map, I think that's a good way at contextualizing the scale score drop. And you could find that in the report card, again, nationsreportcard.gov under the sample questions. So you'll be able to see the percentage correct in both years as well as the change. And I think that will help, again, contextualize some of the narratives that will be around those stories. The item map is another way. We have items that go across the scale where you could see a score at 253 means that students are more likely able to do this. Score at 251, students are more likely to do this, and et cetera. Again, it's available at the nationsreportcard.gov across the scale. So you can see items across the scale would demonstrate the knowledge at those certain points. And then finally, I just wanted to just quickly plug the tools that we have. You see the NAEP Data Explorer at the top left there, but we have many others. If you're concentrating on a state or a district, we have profiles of those states or districts. We also have API services if you have someone who wants to do their own coding to create their own graphics, as well as question tools. And I just mentioned the item maps.
Grady, thank you.
I'll turn it over back to you, Jill.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And that was really interesting to look at the sample question tab and to compare the percentage of students who get things right over time, because that is much easier to understand than the scale scores that seem like mystical numbers sometimes. I would like to turn to Professor Martin West now. Marty West is the academic dean at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. He's a professor there, and he's also the editor-in-chief of Education Next, which is one of those great hybrid journals that both looks at academic research and policy suggestions, and it's written in a really digestible way. I'm always grateful for it. Martin, please tell us what you would like everyone to understand before the NAEP scores come out.
Great. Thank you, Jill, for that introduction. Thank you, Lori, for the opportunity to be part of this webinar. And thanks, Grady, for covering a lot of the details that I now don't need to attend to as much. So I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here as a representative of the National Assessment Governing Board, or NAGB. And what NAGB is an independent, nonpartisan body that Congress created in 1988 to set policy for the NAEP. So among other things, it determines what grades and subjects NAEP will assess, though that's subject to certain congressional mandates as well as the constraints of our budget. NAGB defines the knowledge and skills that will be assessed in each subject. And as it does that, it takes into account how those subjects are taught in American schools. It also sets achievement levels on each exam that are used to describe student performance. And I'll say a bit more about that in just a moment. And then finally, NAGB also seeks to find new ways to make the assessment results meaningful to the public. And often, of course, this involves working directly with and through the media, which is why we jumped at the opportunity to be a part of this session today. We know that Education Writers Association really does a great job in supporting high quality education journalism and are eager to take advantage of that. So NAGB comprises 25 individuals from around the country. By law, its members include 2 state governors from different parties and 2 state legislators from different parties. So as you can imagine, that creates some challenges these days, or at least you might think it would. It's actually worse than that. We have both educators and psychometricians as well. But despite that kind of diversity, we pride ourselves in working in a collegial manner with one another and with our colleagues like Grady at NCES. So I said I would talk a little bit more about setting achievement levels as one of the things that NAGB does. And we do this because this is a source of constant confusion, not setting the achievement levels, but the way in which it's done, we find is a source of confusion in a lot of the coverage related to the NAEP. And so by setting achievement levels, what I mean is that we set expectations for what we mean in terms of a score on the NAEP assessments that we would characterize as being at a basic level of accomplishment, a proficient level of accomplishment, and a more advanced level of accomplishment. And so the way we go about this is that we convene dozens of experts, including teachers, subject matter experts, and experts in standard setting processes, who then receive training on achievement level setting and apply their expertise. And so essentially what they're doing is recommending cut scores based on their expectations for what students should know and be able to do, essentially which questions they should be able to answer correctly, and placing those cut scores on the NAEP scale. And so that's how we draw the line between a basic level of performance, a proficient level of performance, and an advanced level of performance. So this is a process called achievement level setting, also called standard setting, that's not at all unique to NAEP or even to educational testing. So medical boards and state bar organizations, for example, use similar cut scores and standard setting processes to set those cut scores to determine who may practice in their respective professions. The level that we set as proficient, which receives the most attention typically in a NAEP release, it ultimately reflects our judgment as a board, informed by educators and content experts, about what students should know and be able to do in the subject in which they're being assessed. We also think they represent a reasonable definition of where students need to be in math and reading to be on track to enroll in post-secondary education without remediation. But it's critical to keep in mind, and here's where the potential confusion comes in, that these NAEP achievement levels differ from state definitions of whether or not students are performing on grade level as defined by state content standards. And the fact that these numbers can and do differ creates confusion, and it's understandable, not least because the term proficiency is often used for both judgments. So here in Massachusetts, where I am, we use the language of meeting expectations on the state test as the equivalent of proficiency, but many state testing programs actually use that same word. So for example, you may find yourself in a state where the Department of Education reports that 60% of fourth graders tested proficient in math in spring 2022, while the comparable figure for the NAEP exam, when the results come out next week, is 40%. And this would suggest that your state's definition of proficiency is somewhat less demanding than the NAEP proficient standard set by NAEP. So I think that would be a reasonable inference. And that could open up a conversation about which definition is more appropriate given how the test results are reported and used. And over time, we have seen many states raise their grade level proficiency standards to become more similar to NAEP proficient. But it does not mean, if you see one set of numbers from NAEP and another from the state, that the results are necessarily contradictory or that they both don't contain useful information. So we wanted to take a moment to talk about that, and I'm happy to come back to it in questions and answers. I know Grady could clarify it as well. I wanted to close before getting to your questions with a few just tips that my colleagues and I put together for covering the upcoming release. Our first tip is that we think it's always really valuable to put the changes that are observed in a given release. In this case, there's going to be a lot of attention to the changes in scores at the national level and state by state and district by district between 2019 and 2022. I'd encourage you in your coverage to report on those changes, yes, but put them in context. So the national results, for example, we can put them in the context of historical trends. There were a couple of good examples of this in the coverage of the long-term trend NAEP results that came out at the end of the summer. Sarah Mervash of the New York Times, putting them in the context of what we've seen in terms of changes in NAEP performance all the way back to the 1970s. In an article leading up to the release, Aaliyah Wong called attention to the phenomenon we've seen in recent NAEP assessments of higher achieving students pulling away from lower achieving students. And that continued in the long-term trend release. So anything you can do to put the latest changes in a broader context would be useful. Another way to think about doing that for state-specific results is to put state-specific results in the context of the national picture. So a lot of people expect, based on the long-term trend results, that we will see declines in student achievement in grades 4 and grade 8 in a lot of states. Well, when reporting on the changes in specific states, it would be helpful to report what share of states did experience a change. What was the story nationwide? Another thing you might pay attention to is, how does the size of the changes in achievement we're seeing over this 3-year period, how does that compare to the variation in achievement from one state to the next? And I can tell you that the declines of the size that we saw on the long-term trend NAEP over the prior administration are actually much smaller than the differences in performance from very high achieving states on the NAEP and lower achieving states. So that's another way to help people understand what's going on since the last assessment. Second, always look beyond average scores for all students nationally or in a state to see what's happening for specific student subgroups. And the NAEP Data Explorer, as well as the state-specific report cards, are a great resource for doing this, both over the latest 3-year period in this case and historically. So obviously that means looking at racial and ethnic subgroups. It means looking at students with disabilities and English learners, for example, who there's been a lot of speculation about unique challenges they faced over the course of the pandemic. And the nationally representative data from the NAEP provides an opportunity to see whether that has impacted their academic progress, the extent to which that's varied geographically from state to state in the nation. And then finally, it would be useful to, I think, also look at this, the percentile levels that Grady mentioned that allow us to ask separately what's going on with higher achieving students and lower achieving students. So we saw a pattern on the long-term trend results where lower achieving students suffered much larger declines in their achievement over the course of the pandemic. It'll be interesting to see whether that is also the case going forward. So second tip is looking beyond the average scores and trying to provide more nuance about what's happened. A third tip, avoid a one and done approach. So it is often the case that a NAEP release generates a lot of media attention in its immediate aftermath. But we think there's great opportunity for reporters to use NAEP data, including both the latest releases and historical data, as a resource to identify stories to explore over a more extended period of time, perhaps in partnerships with researchers and other experts familiar with education in your state. So third tip, avoid a one and done approach and use NAEP as an ongoing resource to inform your reporting. Fourth tip, keep in mind that NAEP data are much better at showing what has happened than why it's happened. So you want to, because of that, avoid leaping to causal conclusions about what's responsible for changes in achievement. And that is the essence of what we colloquially refer to as misnapery. That was a word on one of Grady's slides that I'll say a little bit more about now. The essence of misnapery is really leaping to causal conclusions on the basis of NAEP data that don't support them. As Grady emphasized, correlation doesn't imply causation. That applies to correlations over time. So when people try and look at what was happening in terms of NAEP achievement prior to the implementation of a policy, either a nationwide policy like No Child Left Behind or a prominent policy at a state, and just sort of in a simple manner try to use changes in NAEP performance over time to ask, did No Child Left Behind work, for example? We don't think it's very useful for that purpose. It also, it applies to correlations across states. So, you know, a lot of people, for example, try to find patterns that they want to promote or interpret in cross-state comparisons. One that gets a lot of attention is that states that don't have strong teachers unions or allow them at all tend to be lower performing on the NAEP, and people often want to argue that that shows that unions are good for student achievement. I don't think NAEP is the right body of evidence in order to draw upon in order to reach those types of conclusions. So it doesn't mean that NAEP data can never be used to reach causal conclusions to say, for example, whether a specific policy worked or didn't, but the type of analysis that is required to establish that type of linkage is time consuming and not something that researchers or reporters will be able to produce in the days or weeks following an initial release. The initial release data is much better for generating hypotheses than for testing them. And I think we can talk about some models of what coverage along those lines could look like. And finally, just one reason why rushing to causal conclusions is not advisable. And this will be my last tip, is to keep in mind that NAEP data always measure both in-school influences on student achievement and out-of-school influences on student achievement. So for example, we know that the Great Recession affected what was happening in schools, the level of expenditure on them, but it also affected students' home lives and the economic stress their families were experiencing. Similarly, the pandemic closed schools. It also placed communities under great economic and health stress. And we know that all of these influences, both inside of schools and outside of schools, matter for how well students are doing. NAEP scores are really an aggregate picture of how our entire society and entire states within the nation, how well they support the production of high levels of student achievement. And we shouldn't think of them as narrowly a measure of the performance of our school system and our state school systems on their own. So let me stop there. I apologize for talking too long and look forward to questions from you, Jill, and from the crowd.
Great, Marty, thank you so much. We have a ton of excellent questions on the Q&A and I want to get to them. My first question and only question for both of you is, you said one and done is not the right way to cover the NAEP. Can you give an example of a second day or a second week story that reporters might look into?
Grady, you want to go first?
Yeah, I'll take the first one. So I alluded to it, and Marty said it very well, that first day, we're going to talk about very high level average scores for different student groups, for states, for districts. I think the next day should really dig into those contextual variables. I know there's a lot of questions about, for example, the resources that teachers had access to, the trainings that teachers had access to over the last 3 years, how that may have changed from 2019. I think there's also questions about what schools did between 2019 and 2022. And for that reason, we had a specific COVID questionnaire that was only asked in 2022 that got at some of those things. And so I think when you're trying to dig into just, states did this or districts did that, to better understand the relationship between the educational environment that the students and the teachers in the schools had over those last 3 years and contextualize that with the findings, I think those are good day 2 and 3, 4, 5 stories.
Yeah, I agree with that. I love the idea of drawing on the contextual data to try and provide a more rich and colorful picture of what students experienced and what could be responsible for the trends in achievement that we see. I think there we really need to keep in mind this danger of racing to strong causal conclusions as we write those kinds of stories. But I think that's a nice idea. I think the other example that I would highlight is identifying outliers in terms of maybe districts that performed relatively well or states that performed relatively well over a period of severe stress, and begin trying to explore what could be going on in those places, what could have gone on over the past 3 years that would help to explain those patterns. Again, with a goal of of generating hypotheses of trying to see if there are other data sources, sort of patterns in state data, for example, that could corroborate or cast doubt on those hypotheses, and just try to piece together a picture of what lessons we might draw from those outliers. I can think of some reporting that's been done over the past several years on the state of Mississippi, which has been a not yet super high achieving state on NAEP, but one that has made dramatic progress, particularly in early reading. And there's been some great reporting that's tried to understand what could be behind that phenomenon, and is a nice example of the type of longer form investigative reporting that can be done.
Yeah, I remember when Mississippi showed some really stratospheric jumps a few testing cycles ago, and that got us thinking about that. Thank you. Sarah Karp has an excellent question, which I'm curious to learn the answer to also. This is for you, Grady. Do school districts get to choose which students at which schools take the NAEP? And also, do the same schools in a big district like Chicago take the NAEP over time?
Great question. So the answer to the first one is no. The administrators at the school do not choose who sits and takes a NAEP. What we do, to say shortly, is we have the Common Core data, which has data on every single student, and we have a separate database for private schools. And our sampling statistician goes in and randomly samples schools, if we talk about a state, within a state, and identify schools, which will allow us to get that, racial, ethnic, that NSLP eligibility, that school location, and that gender breakdown that represents the state, as well as academic achievement, get that variety across the state within schools. After we identify the schools that we're going to go to, we go through the list and we randomly sample somewhere between 15 and 30 students that will actually sit for the NAEP. That's all on us. And then we tell the school, these are the students that will be sampling. And so the school does not decide who sits and takes the NAEP. The second part of the question is schools being sampled each NAEP year. That is definitely a possibility, particularly if you're one of the larger schools in a district. It is not unusual for us to come back to the same school over and over again. We have a term for those schools. I can't think of it right off the top of my head, but it isn't unusual for a school, especially in the TUDA district, where you have a smaller set of schools that we're using to generalize to the whole population, where a school will be sampled more than once. So it is possible for a school to be continually sampled.
Right. So Grady, one more question for you from Becky. I hope I'm pronouncing your last name right, Vivia. When you go to the sample questions, can you actually see what percentage of students got it right in different testing years?
Yes, yeah. So the tool that I talked about, that's actually going to be on the report card, where we can compare the previous year to the current year. Within the NAEPS questions tool, when we do release items, which isn't every year, but when we do release items, you can see the percent of percent of students that not only got the answer correct, but if it's a multiple choice question, you can see the percent that chose A, that chose B, that chose C, or that chose D. And we are revamping that tool a little bit to make it a little more accessible. We've heard some feedback that it's hard to navigate. And so we're already coming up with a new tool within the next couple of months. But yeah, you can identify the percentage that got that certain question correct.
Wonderful. Michael Dannenberg has questions about subgroups. He notices that there's an uptick in the percentage of students who identify as LGBTQ. Does NAEP track LGBTQ students?
We do not. We do not.
Great. So that, no. NAEP reports low-income students as those participating in the National School Lunch Program. Is that still valid with community eligibility?
That's a great question, and something we're keeping a really good eye on. We use the NSLP question as our kind of index, not index, but proxy for socioeconomic status. It's not perfect, but it's pretty good. Nationally, I'll say it's not an issue. For most states, I say it's not an issue, and that's given how we collect the data. Even if a school is community eligible, there also are still forms that parents have to sign, which is where we get our data for the students that would have indicated that they are qualified for the free or reduced program. So within districts, I'll say within TUDA, for some TUDAs in particular, it is starting to become a little bit wobbly. And so I've used that word a lot today. But we are investigating a socioeconomic status index that will include the NSLP variable, but other indicators that also help us understand the socioeconomic status of our students, so that we're not relying on just one question to then categorize whether or not a student is, eligible or not eligible, or low on the SES ladder or high on the SES ladder. We're going to have a group of variables that help us do that a little bit better.
So before that's ready, when I'm looking at New York City, which has community eligibility, is it going to say 100? What is it going to say?
For New York City, I can't say particularly what it will say, but just because a district has that they are community eligible, which means all schools receive it, we don't rely on that. We rely on an actual form that is administered through the school that tells us this student said they would get it and this student said they wouldn't. That's the percentage that we use. Got
it. Marty?
Yeah, I was just going to say, improving our measure of socioeconomic status beyond free lunch eligibility is a real priority for NAGB going forward, and we've been working closely with NCS on doing that. I have been surprised, though, about the fact that the free lunch variable does contain some, it still is able to explain a lot of what's going on in terms of achievement outcomes, and seems to be a useful indicator for getting at issues of equity in education.
Great. So it's not perfect, but we can still use it. Erica Meltzer asks, this is a question for you, Marty. Is the NAEP basic closer to grade level than proficient is? Should either be or neither be thought of as grade level?
I would say neither should be thought of as grade level, because the achievement level setting has a very different purpose. NAEP is not trying to, the construct we're trying to get at is not one that we think of as grade level relative to a specific set of state content standards. In practice, it used to be the case that NAEP basic, though, was, that where most states had set their proficiency lines on state tests was much more comparable to NAEP basic than to NAEP proficient. And so, although conceptually my answer is no, in practice that used to be the case, that NAEP basic and state proficiency definitions tended to be fairly similar. In the past, I guess 8 or so years, a number of states, a majority of states, have increased their definitions of proficiency so that they're actually now closer to NAEP proficient than they are to NAEP basic. And so I wouldn't say that that's true any longer. But again, I don't want to sort of suggest that the two things are trying to do exactly the same thing.
Great. Here's another question about horse races. I love this question. The first question my editor asked about the 2019 results asks Mandy McLaren, where does Kentucky rank? How would you answer that question to my editor?
Well, I would say I would start by answering the question in a straightforward way, which is, if you mean where does the average achievement of our students rank relative to other states, I would give that result taking into mind Grady's advice to pay attention to statistical significance, and that means that there will be a set of states that presumably will outperform Kentucky, where we're confident that that's the case. There will be a set of states that are statistically indistinguishable from Kentucky's performance, and then there will be a set that's below. And so you'll be able to provide a range in terms of where they rank. But then I would say, what do you really mean in terms of where we rank? Is average performance all you care about, or do you care about how much progress we've made over time, how we did in terms of the change in achievement that we experienced over the course of the pandemic? Maybe you mean the size of the gaps in achievement that we have between different student groups. These are all indicators that people could put forward as a measure of education quality. And you could think about where we rank on each of these. So I think there's an initial straightforward state ranking, but then there's an opportunity to really use the NAEP data to put forward different visions of educational quality and think about a more complicated and nuanced picture.
Thank you. Sharon Lurie, hi. She used to be at the Hechinger Report. I'm happy to see your question. Here's one for you, Grady, from her. Will the data compare students in districts that were mostly remote in 2020 and 21 versus students in districts that were mostly in person?
So not explicitly. We do ask questions of our students during the 2020-2021 school year. Did you ever learn remotely? It's a very broad question. It's the same question that we asked with long-term trend that will be asked for the main NAEP report. And so you can look at that question by district, by state. We also have a school questionnaire that asks something very similar and a teacher questionnaire that asks something very similar. So you will be able to make those comparisons. We aren't going to make those comparisons for several reasons. The main one of being is that a remote experience in one place isn't the same as a remote experience on another place. For one student isn't the same as a remote as another student. And just because there were so many other factors that were going on over the last 3 years, that one question does not attempt to capture all of the upheaval and the things that were going on. And so we do caution, if you are going to make those types of comparisons, we do really caution you to understand that it's not picking up all the little things in between there that you know the NAEP questionnaire just didn't attempt to answer. And so using the NAEP Data Explorer, you will be able to find that question as well as, you know, do those comparisons, but we really strongly advise you to consider everything else that could be picked up with those questions when making those comparisons.
Right. We don't know how much they had remote versus how much, I mean, we don't have that kind of granularity, right? That's
right. And we don't know if they were, you know, when they were remote, were they learning, you know, in front of the computer versus were they just at home doing worksheets? I do want to plug later this year or early next year, we did a study called the Monthly School Survey, where we sent out a survey to the schools, asking them, you know, from January to May, are you hybrid? Are you in person? Are you remote? And we're going to collect those data with the schools that we collected in 2022, right? We asked the same school that question in 2021, and they collected NAEP achievement data from them in NAEP 2022. And so we're going to be able to map those questions with the NAEP data that will get us a step closer at understanding the relationship between those two, but those nuances and those idiosyncrasies, I can't say that word, that I mentioned are still valid there. Thank you.
Jill, I just say quickly, there are lots of other sources of evidence on the relative efficacy of in-person versus remote instruction, both in general and over the course of the pandemic, that I think sort of going to NAEP directly for that would probably be the sort of not capitalizing on NAEP's relative strengths when you have other sources of evidence available.
Right. Some researchers have looked at the NWEA NAEP, MAP data and compared that with the amount of in-person learning. Here's a great question from Ann Doss Helms for you, Marty. I understand that correlation is not causation, but is it reasonable to suppose that pandemic disruption caused the big drop we're likely to see?
You know, it's funny, I posed this question directly to Peggy Carr, the commissioner of the National Center on Education Statistics, when we did the long-term trend release, because she and I are always out there trying to caution people about causation. I said, are you willing to, you know, accept that the pandemic caused these changes? And, you know, her answer was, yes, I think we are. And so it's interesting to then think through, all right, why is that the case? I think part is that we're seeing, in the case of that long-term trend result, a clear deviation from a long-term trend, this, you know, first ever decline in one subject, largest in decades in another. But also we do have lots of other sources of evidence telling us that this major disruption to America's schools was in fact very harmful to students' academic progress. And so it's these other sources of evidence that we can bring to our interpretation of NAEP data that I think give me confidence in saying that yes, you know, a lot of what we're seeing in the changes from 2020 to 2022 or 2019 to 2022 for the main NAEP are going to be driven by the influence of the pandemic. Now, even then, though, I think it's going to be hard to say, well, how much was school closures versus how much was the other ways in which the pandemic impacted students and families over the course of the pandemic. So the basic answer is yes. And I think it's because we're in a relatively unusual circumstance where we have lots of other sources of information to draw on. And what the NAEP allows us to do is to provide these nationally representative pictures, in this case, state representative pictures of where those impacts were greatest.
If I could just add one thing to that, that I think Marty's answer was perfect. It's also important to remember where we were before the pandemic. It wasn't like scores were just constantly going up, right? For main NAEP, things are actually declining at 3 to 4 grade subjects. So I think Marty's point is a good one. We can say that some of this is probably because of the pandemic, but let's not say all of it is because of the pandemic. And it's hard to pull out what part is the pandemic and what part isn't, to Marty's point.
Good point.
Grady, I have another technical question for you from Matt Barnum. When you're looking at a particular subject and you've got 4th grade scores and 8th grade scores, can we compare them to each other? So for example, can we say that students typically make 40 points worth of growth in, say, math between 4th grade and 8th grade?
No, you cannot. And the reason you can is because it's not on a cross grade scale, meaning that we don't have items that we ask both 4th graders and 8th graders so that we can disentangle how a 4th grader do, how an 8th grader do, not to mention 7th, 6th, and 5th in between. In order to do that, we'd have to collect our data in a different way that got at, that only did the cross grade comparison with items in both grades, but also surveyed the students in between. And so I'm glad Matt asked that question. We can't say that 40 points is, is a great level or 10 points is a great level. We've seen a lot of those misnaperies.
It's not the same scale.
It's not the same scale, right?
Man.
Even within the same subject, I know you want to, and we're trying to figure out, that's a question we always get, but we can't do that with the main NAEP.
Okay. We have a bunch more questions about these proficiency thresholds. Just to recap, is it fair to say that the NAEP is generally more rigorous and has a higher standard for proficiency than many state assessments? And then I think that is generally the case, although the state assessments, like you said earlier, were rising. What does basic achievement mean on the NAEP? How do we explain it?
Okay. If you look at the percentage of students who are deemed proficient by NAEP, state by state, and you compare that to the percentage of students who perform at a proficient level in the same grade and subject as defined by the state test. And sometimes that will be called meeting expectations, sometimes that will be called satisfactory, sometimes that will be called proficient. But if you just find that comparable statistic, which is used in federal accountability policy, the share of students who are proficient according to the states is typically higher than the share of students who meet NAEP proficient. So can we say that NAEP has a more rigorous definition of proficiency? Well, in theory, some of that difference could be reflected differences in the precise content of what states choose to focus on relative to what NAGB defines as math and reading for the NAEP. But I think that's a bit of a distraction. And in general, you can say NAEP's definition is more rigorous or more demanding. What was the rest of the question?
What does basic mean? How do we explain that?
Yeah, let me try and get you some language on basic.
Do you have your own kind of notion of it, Marty?
Grady, you start talking. I saw you wanted to get in there and try and pull up the official language here.
Yeah, just again, I agree with Marty saying there's two things. One, we do a study called the Mapping State Proficiency Standards, where you can actually quantify what a state proficient is and put their state proficient on the NAEP scale to better understand, okay, my state proficient maps within basic, within proficient. And so you can look that up on the NCS website. For basic, I think Marty's looking it up, but is partial mastery over the knowledge and skills required in that subject. So that's kind of where we put it. Proficiency means you got it all. Basic means you almost got it all, but you're not quite there. And advanced is you've completely mastered it. So that's kind of our way of contextualizing that. And I think along with the items and things across the scale and with the achievement levels, you can kind of get a picture of what we mean.
And I will say NAGB has a new document that will be part of the release. I believe it's already on the website, called NAEP Achievement Levels, Understanding What Students Can Do in Mathematics and Reading, that actually gives some high-level examples of skills that would constitute NAEP Basic. Mastery of those skills would equate to NAEP Basic achievement, and partial mastery or prerequisite knowledge for being proficient, as Grady used, is the language that we use.
Great. Okay, let's move on. So this is a really good question from Sharon again. What are some of the questions on the questionnaire asked for the very first time this year in 2022?
So I think that's a great way for me to say you see all the questions, all the contextual questions. So if you just simply Google NAEP contextual questionnaires, you'll see by subject, by grade, by teacher, school, and student, all the questions we ask. To highlight a couple of them, I just mentioned the student question about, did you ever learn remote last year? Some of the teachers one is, did you receive any training on how to deliver online classes? How confident are you as a teacher? For the school one, we asked percent, eligible. We asked about Title I funding. We asked about laptops. We asked so many questions. That's why I was just undergirding that. It's such a rich array of questions to get at the student educational environment. But you can find all of them on the website.
Terrific. Do you reveal which schools in a state you sampled?
No, we do not. If you're on Twitter, you'll often see the state, the school say, hey, I just completed a NAEP, but we don't. There's a NAEP coordinator for each state. That person will know the schools, but as far as advertising and sharing that list publicly, we do not do that.
Right. Do we know yet when we put out some information for journalists if they would like the embargoed scores to email a communications person at Hechinger Sharp? That should be on the chat screen. CLLAMIDO@HechingerSharp.com. Do we know yet what day the embargoed data is going to be released?
The embargoed data will be available Thursday morning. We shoot for 10 a.m., but oftentimes things they sign off, so maybe a little later, with the briefing being the next day at 1 p.m.
Great. And let's see.
Jill, I have one I'd like to answer, if that's all right. So
please.
Julia James asks, is the data broken down by district in every state or just the major urban districts? NAEP only releases district level data for the TUDA, the Trial Urban District Assessment Districts. There are, what, 24 or 26 of them, Grady?
26.
Very large districts. But I will mention that one of my colleagues at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, Tom Kane, and Sean Reardon of Stanford University are going to use the NAEP data to create comparable measures of achievement loss based on state tests in specific states for every district that has released state test results. And those will be out in the days following the release next week. And we'll provide an opportunity for follow-up coverage potentially, where you can look at what happened in the state as a whole and then see what's happened. That would not be information from NAEP or NAGB only. It's drawing on state test information well, but using it in a way to, I think, provide a richer picture of what's happening for America's students.
Oh, whoops. Thank you. Terrific. We are approaching 2 p.m. and I'd like to end on time. There are a few questions we didn't get to, and I'm sorry to the reporters for our technical difficulties. I want to thank Grady Wilburn and Marty West for answering everything so concisely. I really appreciate that. Lori, is there any housekeeping before we end?
Yeah, I want to say thank you, Jill, for terrific job moderating, and thank you again, Grady and Marty. I thought it was terrific conversation. We will do a follow-up email to everyone with Grady's slides and with who to email for the embargoed reports. In the chat section, you'll see an evaluation, a link to an evaluation survey. Please fill it out so that we can improve our product. We thank you all for joining us today for this very important conversation. And we hope to see you in a couple of weeks when we hold a webinar on teacher shortages. Keep an eye out for that and for other EWA events. With that, thanks everyone.